This is a re-recording of a talk I gave at All Saints Church in Oakham on Halloween in 2024. It's entitled A Time to Mourn and a Time to Dance, the All Saints Season Through the Ages. Last time I gave a talk of this nature at the Queen Edith Festival last March, I began by admitting I was something of an imposter and my real expertise lay elsewhere, mainly in rather obscure branches of engineering, but in historical terms in 19th century Black Country history, neither of which are terribly relevant to what I am about to say tonight. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, I fear you have an imposter in your midst. Be that as it may, you'll be quite aware that we're at the beginning of a quite intensive run of festivals of different sorts. In ecclesiastical terms, the Feast of All Saints and All Souls, nominally on the 1st and 2nd of November, tomorrow and Saturday, but which we'll be celebrating on Sunday and Monday. Then we have the more secular celebrations of Halloween tonight, Bonfire Night on Tuesday, November the 5th, but which will mainly be celebrated in different places over the coming weekend, and Remembrance Day on Monday, November the 11th, but again with the main ceremonies held next Sunday. In this talk, I hesitate to call it a lecture because that sort of implies expertise. I want to trace how these festivals came about and how they interact with each other, at least as far as Britain and to an extent Ireland are concerned. In doing the research for this talk, I've been let down some fascinating alleyways of knowledge and I've really rather enjoyed myself. Hopefully what I have to say may be of interest to you and perhaps also to a limited extent enjoyable. As a working title for the season I'm thinking about, I'll refer to it as the All Saints season, that extends from the end of October through to the middle of November. The title, of course, is taken from the book of Ecclesiastes. I suspect that for those of a certain age, they will know this passage from the version by the soft rock group The Byrds in the 1960s. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. I chose the title because the season is indeed one of contrasts, of joy and sadness, of light and dark. But before going any further, it's worth pointing out that this isn't the first time there's been a special series of events here at All Saints in the All Saints season. On October the 10th, 1858, the church was reopened after its restoration. It should have been on All Saints' Day, but the work inevitably went on rather longer than it should have done. You can see that the events advertised were mainly sermons. The church was filled on at least some of those occasions, and I doubt sermons would be that attractive today. There are also similarities in financial terms. There was a deficit of £300 on the total project cost of £4,000, and the collections were devoted to that. Not unlike our deficit on our current lighting appeal, perhaps. But on to the talk. In thinking about the material, it's clear that in the development of the season, there are a number of what one might call strands, as in a rope that sort of twist around each other. So it seems to me that a way of presenting the material is to think of each of these strands separately and then think about how they interact with each other. Now, up to the time of the Reformation, it seems to me there are two major strands, and I'll call them the seasonal strand and the sacral strand. Each of these strands are composed of different threads, although perhaps that's pushing the metaphor a bit too far. And after discussing the nature of these strands, I'll go on to argue that the Reformation caused major disruption. But after the Reformation, by the late 1500s, these strands had reformed, although composed of perhaps rather different threads, and a third one added, that I'll call the secular strand. And this gives a pleasing three-way alliteration, such as is beloved of preachers, of which of course I am one. And whilst I'll basically try to get this as a historical talk, it will inevitably have a Christian perspective, because I am who I am, very much with an Anglican bias. So We begin by thinking about the pre-Reformation era, and firstly the seasonal strand. For all agricultural and pastoral societies, the development of a calendar of some sort is a necessity, to know when crops should be planted and harvested, when animal migrations will occur, and so on. Now, there are two basic types of calendars that are found to this day, the solar and the lunar. Both have an effect on how the season of All Saints has been developed. Of most importance to this particular season is the solar calendar. All Saints comes at a fixed time of year as autumn closes in and the rigours of winter begins. The influence of the lunar calendar is less obvious, but comes from the fact that the central religious events that are commemorated are in the Christian tradition, and they ultimately derive from the death and resurrection of Jesus, events that are defined by the Jewish lunar calendar. And the feasts that celebrate the death and resurrection move through the year by year, through the solar calendar. And we'll see that this has influenced at times the date of All Saints' Day in particular. Getting the relationship between the lunar calendar and the solar calendar correct was of huge importance to early Christians, obviously so that the date of Easter would be correct, and this led to a sort of form of calendric mysticism, seeing in the overlapping lunar and solar cycles something about the nature of time and the nature of God. In the British Isles there have been two basic solar calendars. The first is built around the quarter days, the spring equinox, the summer solstice, the autumn equinox, and the winter solstice. From an early period, perhaps from the early Anglo-Saxon era, these quarter days have been sacralised and aligned roughly with Christian feasts as Lady Day, the Feast of the Annunciation in March, the birth of John the Baptist, and the feast days of St. Peter and St. Paul in the middle of summer, the feast of St. Michael and All Angels or Michaelmas in autumn, and of course Christmas Day. These correspond with the approximate middle of our four seasons: spring, summer, autumn and winter. But in the Gaelic and Brittonic speaking areas of the British Isles, Ireland, Scotland and Wales, the seasons were marked by festivals that approximately aligned with the mid-quarter days. Here I have to admit that the pronunciation of Gaelic names is pretty much beyond me, but I'll do my best. We have Imbolc at the start of February, Beltane at the start of May, Lunasha at the start of August, and Samhain at the start of November. These correspond to the beginnings and the endings of the four seasons. And again, they have become to a degree sacralized after the conversion to Christianity in late antiquity. Imbolc became Candlemas, Lunasha became Lammas, Loafmas, Samhain becomes All Hallows or All Saints, and it's this, of course, that is of main interest to us at the moment. Sacralisation never really worked for Beltane, and all it managed was to become the feast of St. Philip and St. James, two apostles about whom little or nothing is actually known. Historically, the records, such as they are, suggest that before the Reformation, Samhain was a time when there were widespread celebrations and feasts in Ireland, Wales and Scotland, as families and tribes gathered together, a community time. The Venerable Bede in the 7th century refers to the month of November as Blood Monath in pagan Anglo-Saxon times, Blood Month, where animals are slaughtered before the winter and their meat salted. And this may well have been an aspect of Samhain for the 1,000 years or so that follow the conversion. The number of folk tales of witches, fairies, goblins and so on that have Samhain as their setting suggests it was regarded as an uncanny time when the spirits were abroad. There is, however, no evidence at all of religious rites, of sacrifices to gods and so on. Now this is hardly surprising in my view. All of the British Isles was thoroughly Christianized by the 6th and 7th centuries, and although we read tales of the early evangelists contending with demons, they tend to run out near the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon period in the century after the conversion. One of the last such group of tales seems to belong to the life of St. Guthlac in Crowland, not far from here in the fens around Peterborough in the early 700s, where he battled against demons and demigods. Recently, on an early morning train trip seeing the mist drifting across the fens around Whittlesea, it still seemed like an ideal place for demons to inhabit. But after Guthlac's time, there's no record of worship or of anyone else other than the Christian God, and the former warnings by bishops against pagan practices cease about that time too. There is, however, evidence, albeit from a rather late date, that the festival is also marked by the lighting of fires, perhaps as a protection against the surrounding spirit world, or perhaps for the purposes of divination, as it's known to be the case at Beltane, for example. In England and much of Europe, however, the situation was somewhat different, and the community and feasting aspects of the season were centred on Martinmas on November the 11th, the Feast of St. Martin, which was seen as the end of the harvest and the start of winter. St. Martin was a 4th century Roman soldier who couldn't reconcile his Christianity with a military life and became a hermit and then a bishop at Tours in France. He was much loved by his congregations and was very active in the destruction of pagan temples and sacred groves. Moving on now to the second strand, the sacral. From the depths of time, it's possible to discern in the archaeological and written records a deep human concern with ancestors, with careful preparation of bodies for burial, storage of ancestors' bones, and so on through cultures as diverse as the ancient Egyptians and the Neolithic Bronze and Iron Age inhabitants of these islands. At the start of the Christian era in the Mediterranean, it was commonplace for families to meet at the tombs of ancestors to eat and in some sense share with the dead a celebratory meal. There is some evidence that at the Feast of Samhain, in particular in Ireland, and to a lesser extent in Scotland and Wales, the spirits of the ancestors were perceived to be abroad and needed to be appeased by offerings of food and drink. Now, one striking exception to these practices concerned with the ancestors seems to have been in the Jewish tradition, where there was no clear concept of the afterlife and certainly no indication that the ancestors were in any way concerned with the living. Indeed, any attempts to contact ancestors or to appease them was strictly forbidden under the Torah. At the start of the Common Era, there were two schools of thought within Judaism. The first envisaged a rather nebulous and shadowy afterlife for the dead in Sheol, again from the book of Ecclesiastes. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no further reward, and even their name is forgotten. Ecclesiastes was a cheery soul. The other school held to a developing concept of a heavenly resurrection from the dead. These were the Sadducees and the Pharisees of the biblical accounts. The events of the Jewish month of Nisan in the year 33 or thereabouts were to change all that. The passion and the resurrection of Jesus. Whatever one makes of these events, one thing about them is certain, that the relationship between the dead and the living was radically changed for the followers of Christ. The hope of an eternal existence and some sort of physical resurrection was and is the core of the Christian story, with the belief that life continues beyond the grave. This radical change in belief was to have several implications both for Jewish and non-Jewish Christians that were to be worked out over the centuries. The first was the concept that for the heroes of the faith, the martyrs, those who had lived particularly holy lives, their death meant a direct entry to the presence of God. From this there arose quite early in the Christian era the concept of the saints in heaven being in close relationship with the saints on earth. From the letter to the Hebrews written in the second half of the 1st century. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. The boundary between the church triumphant in heaven and the church militant here on earth was perceived as very thin and porous, and the saints took the place of ancestors in the lives and rituals of many. In the early centuries, meals were eaten around the tombs of these saints, as they had been around the tombs of ancestors, which in turn led to the development of churches around these tombs, where the Christian meal of the Eucharist was celebrated, often within cemeteries. The Basilica of St. Peter in Rome is the most magnificent outworking of this around the grave of St. Peter. In essence, the saints became part of the Christian family in a specific location. And it's clear from the records that many Christians felt a very close and real relationship with their local saint or with the saint they were named after. This isn't something that with our 20th century materialistic mindset we can easily understand, but it was of huge importance to those in the Middle Ages. From this, the medieval cult of the saints developed, with churches of increasing magnificence being built around the tombs of saints or part of saints, their relics, with pilgrimage to particularly holy sites. And saints were appropriated by different groups in society as their patrons. For example, the two saints I've mentioned who are commemorated on May Day, Beltane, the two little-known apostles, Philip and James. Philip became the patron saint of bakers and cooks, and James the patron saint of hatters. Generally, the major celebration of any particular saint or martyr was on the anniversary of their death, or if that wasn't known, then some arbitrary day related to Easter or Pentecost was often chosen. But there were, of course, many minor saints and martyrs and holy men and holy women who weren't celebrated universally and whose death date was generally not known. And it was this that led to the idea of celebrating this crowd of witnesses on a particular day. From the 4th century onwards, the celebration of All Hallows seems to have been held on days at fixed times around Easter and Pentecost, Friday after Easter, Sunday before Pentecost, something like that. And this remains the case of some of the Eastern churches, and that, of course, is on the lunar calendar. However, in Northern Europe, churches began to celebrate the feast on November the 1st on the solar calendar, and this practice was extended to the whole Catholic Church by Pope Gregory IV in the 9th century. It's not clear why this date was chosen. There are a couple of possible reasons. One was that Gregory's predecessor had consecrated the Basilica of St. Peter's on November the 1st. That might be a reason. But clearly another reason might have been that this date coincided with the date of Samhain and similar feasts elsewhere in Europe where the ancestral spirits were felt to be active. But as I say, that's really speculative. The feast clearly proved popular, however, and the church dedication to All Saints or All Hallows is now the third most popular in England, so I'm afraid this church is really very common. There were, of course, many other Christians and the saints and martyrs that were so honoured and exalted, and the line of thought developed over the centuries that these didn't go straight into the presence of God, but rather to purgatory, a place of purging and preparation, the nature of which could be quite benign. The picture on the left shows the dead being made to look at a tree laden with succulent fruit to banish the last traces of gluttony, or could be more severe, with the obligatory taste of hellfire as in the picture on the right, and the length of stay, one might say sentence, was dependent upon the nature of one's life on earth. This period could be shortened by the prayers of the faithful still living, or much more effectively by the prayers of the saints in heaven, who are already in the presence of God. And this led to the practice of invoking the saints to pray for dead loved ones, and that evolved over the centuries. And it was a very radical change in concept from the pre-Christian era in all parts of Europe, and it took a strong hold within the British churches. By the time of the Reformation, the concept of praying for those who had died, both directly and through one's favourite saint or saints, had become the norm. The institution of a day of general prayer for the departed on November the 2nd is due to Adillo, Abbot of Cluny, who died in 1048. It was chosen to follow All Saints' Day. Having celebrated the feast of all the members of the church who are believed to be in heaven, the church on earth turns on the next day to commemorate the souls believed to be still in purgatory and to pray for them. Again, the choice of date was, of course, perfectly consistent with the date of Samhain and other similar festivals. The idea of purgatory and the need for prayers for the dead had many consequences. One of these was the trend towards establishing chantries, to pay priests to say masses and to pray for the souls of specific departed and for their release from purgatory. And in many medieval churches there would have been altars dedicated to this purpose. Here at All Saints, it's likely that the guild altars dedicated to the Holy Trinity, All Saints and St Mary, the modern Trinity Chapel, Chancel and Lady Chapel, would also have been used for this purpose, together with the other guild chapels located where the old grammar school now stands, dedicated to St Michael and St Mary. The existence of communion shelves or piscinas in the north and south transepts suggests there was an altar on their east side walls too that were again likely to have been used as chantries. The communion shelf in the south transept, however, seems to have been repurposed somewhat. It's possible too that here at All Saints there were relics. 19th century reports describe a cupboard in the east wall for that purpose, and it's still marked by a shelf in the late 19th century stonework. While this may have been the case, I have to say I'm far from convinced. But of course there is a more proven place of relics locally, at Brook, and the Brook reliquary can be seen in the County Museum. Another consequence of the concept of purgatory that is perhaps less attractive, was the selling of indulgences. By suitably donating to the church, the time your loved ones spent in purgatory could be reduced. Apparently, John Van Tetzel is said to have coined the phrase, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory doth spring." So just prior to the Reformation in the 1500s, ordinary Christians would have experienced the liturgical expressions of All Saints' Day, the ceremonial of the High Mass and processions to shrines, and the call to prayer for the dead on All Souls' Day. The primary liturgical celebration of the latter was the ringing of bells for the encouragement of the dead, to show that they hadn't been forgotten. In parts of the British Isles, these celebrations would have been accompanied by family and community celebrations, perhaps with the lighting of fires, and generally there was an enhanced awareness of the reality of the spirit world all around them. The two strands of the seasonal and the sacral had thus become completely entwined. But the Reformation, of course, was to change all that. This isn't the place to give the history of the Reformation or to chart its different courses across the countries of Europe. It is usually said to have begun in 1517, when Martin Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, with one of his major targets being the sale of indulgences. Uniquely in England, it led to the considerable enrichment of the monarchy, in this case Henry VIII, through the dissolution and sale of the monasteries overseen by Thomas Cromwell, and to a reformed Protestant national church with a quite conservative liturgical provision, as well as a wide range of fissiparous nonconformist churches. So let's move on to see how the season developed after the Reformation. As I said, both the seasonal and the sacral strands were to reform, perhaps with rather different threads, and we'll see that a third was added, the secular. Again, we consider each in turn. Firstly, the Martinmas feasting tradition in England seems to have died out and wasn't revived, and the community and the family celebrations moved to the Feast of All Saints and All Souls at the start of the month, effectively merging with the Samhain celebrations in the rest of the islands. Indeed, Martinmas was known as the Old Halloween, particularly after the loss of 11 days in the calendar change of 1752. In the regions where Catholicism remained strong, particularly in Ireland and Scotland, the seasonal strand at Samhain continued much as before. As the sources become more widespread, we can see that in all parts of these islands there were collections for provisions for the feasts associated with this strand, often with collecting songs. For example, the soul cake tradition. A soul, a soul cake. Please, good missus, a soul cake. An apple, a pear, a plum or a cherry, or any good thing to make us merry. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, 3 for him who made us all. Similar collecting songs were widespread across the country, including the more Protestant areas. The collections are often accompanied by lanterns made from candles within hollowed-out mangel wurzels or turnips. It remained an uncanny time, and there are records of bonfires for either protection or divination continuing across England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, the evidence usually coming from reports of clergy attempting to suppress them. Even where they were actually successful in doing so, the traditions changed, either to small handheld fires, such as those in Lancashire consisting of a bunch of straw at the end of a fork, or small bonfires known as tyndals around Derby, which seem to have had an association with praying for the dead in purgatory. In addition, a tradition of disguising begins to appear in the record, seemingly at first to protect those who disguise themselves from witches and fairies, and this inevitably evolved into pranks and games. This began in Ireland, but quickly spread with the emigration of the Irish to England and Scotland in the 18th and 19th centuries. It also passed to the United States, and from there back to England through immigrants and visitors, and we all know where that was to lead to, don't we? But again, it needs to be stressed that there's no evidence at all that pagan deities were worshipped at the time. That such worship continued underground throughout the Christian era is largely an invention of the Victorian folklorists, and in particular Sir James Fraser of Trinity College, Cambridge, particularly dodgy institution, and Margaret Murray of University College and president of the Folklore Society. This concept has been thoroughly debunked in recent years by historians who, quite reasonably, went back to the source material and found nothing there. But nonetheless, this concept has entered the popular imagination, and many would still believe that pagan worship continued underground beneath a thin veneer of Christianity, despite the complete lack of any evidence for this. That being said, it's perhaps worth digressing to consider the concept of fairies, spirits and witches just a little at this point. Was there any reality behind the fears and worries apparent in so many of the stories of the seasonal thread that derive from Samhain? As someone who believes in a creator God, I don't find it difficult to believe that other, what one might call spiritual entities exist in our world. But if they did, or indeed do, recent scholarship has shown that they're very much dressed in the clothes of beings that ultimately find their origin in classical Greek and Roman myths and folk tales, mediated through the medieval church. They've been moulded, if not created, by men and women. As such, if they're human creations, even in a secondary sense, they will, like humans, be a complex mix of the good and the bad and be in need of redemption. With regard to the witches so feared at Samhain, these probably derive from the ancient wise woman or cunning folk traditions, or from simple fear of older ladies who refuse to be bound by social conventions. There may be a few such in Oakham still. Moving on now to the sacral thread. This strand was, of course, most affected by the Reformation. As in other countries, the unscriptural doctrines of purgatory, selling of indulgences, and praying to the saints for the departed were obvious targets for the reformers. Article 22 of the 39 Articles reads, "The Romish doctrine concerning purgatory, pardons, worshipping and adoration, as well of images as of relics, and also invocation of saints, is a fond thing vainly invented, and grounded upon no warranty of Scripture, but rather repugnant to the Word of God." In the prayer book of 1549 and in all those that followed, All Saints' Day was retained as a festival, but as a simple commemoration of the lives of past saints, rather than an affirmation of the unity of Church triumphant and Church militant. Saints were at best seen as examples and role models. For example, the hymn "How Bright These Glorious Spirits Shine" by the 17th century hymn writer Isaac Watts contains these verses. "Lo, these are they from sufferings great who came to realms of light, and in the blood of Christ have washed their robes that shine so bright. Now with triumphal palms they stand before the throne on high, and serve the God they love amidst the glories of the sky. Here the saints are pictured and their heavenly state described in their possibly favourite pastime of waving palm branches around, but there's no indication that there's any possibility of human interaction as in the old pre-Reformation days, and we can see this in some of the hymns that we still sing. All Souls' Day was not mentioned in the prayer book at all, and the concept of praying to the saints and for the departed was, as far as it was possible, abolished, although the personal prayers of individuals couldn't, of course, be so prescribed. For example, the small fires mentioned above were regarded by some as surrogates for prayers for their loved ones. Also, of course, the graves of the dead were still visible and still received the attention of their families, and there could be no prohibition on whatever private prayers might have been offered there. Ringing bells for the dead was intermittently banned and restored during the reign of Edward VI, Mary and Elizabeth after the Reformation, but sporadically continued for many years in a number of places despite clergy opposition. Nonetheless, until the Tractarian revival of the 19th century, the practice of praying for the departed was absent from the Church's liturgy. Even now, for many parts of the Church of England and the nonconformist churches, such prayer is definitely not encouraged, in public at least, and there's often a hesitancy about the practice. The invocation of the prayers of the saints of the departed, too, has really departed from mainstream Anglican and nonconformist traditions. I mentioned earlier that after the Reformation a third strand appeared, which I called the secular. The secular strand first arose in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, where it became the practice to ring church bells, usually in the evening, to celebrate her accession date, conveniently timed for the season, on November the 17th. This began after the Catholic rebellion of 1569 as a mark of loyalty. Whilst theoretically not at all connected with the early practices of ringing for the dead, many would no doubt have made that connection. And this practice continued after her death, particularly in London, as a form of protest. The bells were rung for her on November the 17th and very ostensibly not rung for the birthdays of Charles I and his Catholic wife Henrietta Maria on November the 19th and 16th respectively. Who would have thought that bell ringers could be such radical protesters? The same situation arose after the Restoration, with the bells ringing on November the 17th, in contrast with a non-celebration of Charles II's Catholic wife, Catherine of Braganza, on November the 15th. Maybe the older bells in Oakham's Ring of Eight, which at least before their recast in 1910 date from that period, were used for such seditious purposes. It would be nice to think so. The next thread in the secular strand is, of course, the events of November the 5th, 1605, gunpowder, treason and plot and all that. It was clearly very thoughtfully timed for the All Saints season, and the celebratory bonfires and papal effigies that resulted were almost immediately popular and have remained so to this day, although not in a direct way a continuation of the bonfires of the Reformation, bonfires of protection and divination in the pre-Reformation strand. They were certainly matched the mood of celebration and provision of light that were characteristic of the old ways. Fireworks were used almost from the start, at least for the larger events, the technique of making them having come from China a couple of hundred years earlier. And this is perhaps the most international aspect of the season. Sporadic attempts were made to ban them, most notably by the Catholic James II in the early 1680s, but these were mostly futile. Again, most suitably for the season, William of Orange, scourge of the Catholics, landed in England on November the 5th, 1688. James II fled to France, and the Glorious Revolution began. The essentially secular festival did, however, become entwined with a sacral strand, with a liturgy being produced by the Church of England and used through to the mid-19th century. This had specific responses, readings and prayers that would be used on November the 5th, which included this gem. Almighty God, we yield thee our unfeigned thanks and praise for the wonderful and mighty deliverance of our late gracious sovereign King James, the Queen, the Prince, and all the royal branches, with the nobility, clergy, and commons of England, then assembled in Parliament, by popish treachery appointed as sheep to the slaughter, in the most barbarous and savage manner, beyond the examples of former ages. From this unnatural conspiracy thy providence delivered us. Therefore unto thy name be ascribed all honour and glory, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. We don't have collects like that anymore. And that one wouldn't have done a great deal for ecumenical relations, would it? The liturgy for the day was actually withdrawn in 1849. And of course, in the secular strand, we have Remembrance Day on November the 11th, commemorating in the first instance the end of the Great War in 1918. When this annual remembrance was first suggested, there was a move to create a bank holiday as a day of celebration, and this was resisted by the then government on the grounds that there should be a solemn act of remembrance rather than the celebrations that would result from a bank holiday. Indeed, in the first instance, the only act of remembrance that was specified was the silence on November the 11th, on whatever day of the week it was, although specific liturgies, Sunday services were soon to develop. This decision seems to have been wise and to a large extent responsible for the fact that Remembrance Sunday has retained its importance and is usually the final act of the All Saints season. But over the last 50 years or so, another aspect has been added to the season that fits with both the seasonal and the sacral strands: the rise of what has been called modern paganism, for which the Feast of Samhain is a significant time. Modern paganism exists in many different forms, but one of its underlying concepts seems to be a desire to recover the uncanniness of the season, for which I have every sympathy. But with this quite often comes a pantheistic approach to creation, that God and creation are one and the same, which is certainly not consistent with the Christian idea of a transcendent God that is both within and separate from the created world. Some forms of paganism also see this as an occasion for worship of their gods, primarily the duality of the mother goddess and the horned god, which, it has to be said again, doesn't seem to have much historical justification, and it's clear it hasn't been an aspect of this festival for most of the last 1500 years. Indeed, the origins of some of the pagan deities worshipped today lie in literary movements in the 19th century. The literary recreation of natura, nature personified, and the minor Greek god Pan. Nonetheless, this brings a completely new strand to the season, one that has considerable spiritual power for its adherents. And all of this, of course, brings us to the present, where we see our three strands to the season thoroughly entwined, with each of the current elements of the season reflecting to a greater or lesser degree all three of them. While the precise dates of the various festivals have slipped somewhat, often to the nearest available weekend, we now go through them in their calendar order. Modern Halloween on October the 31st is in the main a secular celebration, although it clearly has a seasonal aspect. Welcome to the Oakham spooky season. Sometimes it seems, with its demand for sweets and other goodies, almost to be a license for robbery with menaces. It's common, particularly amongst churchgoers, to bemoan the commercialisation and trivialisation of the day, although a church has in the past sold indulgences to fill its coffers is perhaps in no position to moan. I do, however, object to the use of pumpkins, American interlopers, as lanterns rather than turnips or mango wurzels. I think I might start a campaign for the reintroduction of turnip lanterns. The importance of Halloween to modern paganism has taken on a sacral aspect for its adherents. Whilst one should be respectful of those involved and perhaps welcome the emphasis on the uncanniness of the season, the Church should nonetheless be very wary of worship focused on anything other than Jesus, the way, the truth and the life, be it the worship of material possessions or spiritual beings. Also on October the 31st, the Church, now with a deep implicit irony, celebrates the life of Martin Luther, from whom the Reformation sprang. He will probably be absolutely horrified to be remembered on the eve of the day of the commemoration he sought to abolish, the anniversary of the day he actually posted his 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg. In many European countries, the day is celebrated as Reformation Day or held the Sunday before as Reformation Sunday, an echo of which can be found in the Anglican Bible Sunday with which it coincides. With regard to All Saints itself, on November the 1st, a body of powerful new liturgical material has become available in recent years, and I sense that once again the concept of the proximity of the heavenly and the earthly, the church triumphant and the church militant, is being much more consistently reflected in the liturgy, and is now more than a mere commemoration of the saints of old. The preface that will be used in the Eucharistic prayer on All Saints' Day. And now we give you thanks, most gracious God, surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses and glorified in the assembly of your saints. The glorious company of apostles praise you. The noble fellowship of prophets praise you. The white-robed army of martyrs praise you. We, your holy church, acclaim you in communion with angels and archangels and with all who served you on earth and worship you now in heaven. We raise our voice to proclaim your glory. I think that clearly reflects the trend of moving back more to considering the commemoration of the great cloud of witnesses that surround us. And in the ceremonies of All Saints' Day, in the rituals of them, I believe we have in our formal Anglican worship something that can meet the needs, the deep human need of many for ceremonial and ritual, that won't go away even though we should deny it. Recently too, there have been wider liturgical innovations. All Saints' Day has become the first day of a liturgical season that extends to Advent, in which the lectionary explores the former traditional Advent themes of death, judgment, heaven and hell, perhaps after the realization that to try to make Advent about anything other than the preparation for Christmas is a losing battle. There's one more thing though I'd like to say about All Saints itself. Specifically, I think that there is a potential for it to become part of a much fuller seasonal liturgy. The Church since the Reformation has to a great extent ceded the seasonal calendar to others, to commercial interests, to New Age mystics and to modern paganism. I would suggest that there's an opportunity to recapture that ground and provide a coherent and dramatic seasonal liturgy built around the 8 solar calendar points that both celebrate the changing seasons and the world God has given us, but also tells the Christian story. Or in more theological terms, to redeem the calendar and consecrate the seasons, to recover that calendaring mysticism that Bede spoke about. We do it already to some degree, of course, specifically with Christmas, Easter and Harvest, but I think an overall coherent liturgical structure will give a framework and a focus for the growing outdoor church movement and for concerns over climate change and environmental degradation, moving beyond the current creation season, which has been rather tacked onto the liturgy in September time. The Festival of All Saints will be crucial in any such liturgical framework. In some ways, the culmination of the season, the drawing together of the events of the previous year, the turning of the seasons, and the apex of the Christian story. Something to consider perhaps. All Souls' Day on November the 2nd was reinstated into the prayer book in 1928 and found its proper place in the liturgy of the Church. It continues to provide for many, both within and without the Church, focus for their prayers and their thoughts for their loved ones, with the candles that are so often used being direct line of descent from the small fires that were ignited after the Reformation. This has come at a time where there have been major shifts in the nature of funerary practices. Firstly, the most common form for a funeral is now cremation, and with a scattering of the ashes of the deceased's favourite locations, often there is no place for mourners to return to. Lighting a candle in church for the departed can fill a gap here, be it on All Saints Souls Day or at other times. And secondly, funerals and funerary monuments have moved away from proclaiming the hope of the Christian of resurrection towards a celebration of the departed's place within the family and a somewhat incoherent belief that those departed and their family will meet again. This was very clear for me from a study I recently carried out on the memorial inscriptions in the large 9-acre churchyard of the church where we worshipped in Lichfield, where there was a significant shift in the nature of the inscriptions. Up to around 1940, they were very much centred on the Christian hope of resurrection, but since then they've come to reflect the deceased role as mother, father, grandparent, and in some cases uncle, auntie, great-grandparent, and so on, or in terms of their role within society, with a vague hope tacked at the end that they'll all meet again. And the deceased is spoken of in such glowing terms that sometimes one wonders, looking at the grave inscriptions, what actually happened to the curmudgeonly and miserable old grandfathers and grandmothers. They don't ever seem to have existed. But perhaps this lost hope of eternity is something that the All Souls service can help to rebuild, as well as continuing to meet the emotional need of the bereaved and to help them remember those that they've lost. On November the 5th, Bonfire Night continues to meet the universal need for a good knees up as winter closes in, and with its fun and fireworks surely reflects the old bonfires of the pre-Reformation period. We see on the slide an effigy of the former Prime Minister about to be burnt at Lewes. No doubt the current Prime Minister, or perhaps the Chancellor, will feature there at some stage. And recently a new liturgical feast has been added to the season, 1 week after All Saints Day. The Saints and Martyrs of England on November the 8th. Some of these martyrs come from a relatively recent past, a reminder perhaps that, to quote T.S. Eliot, there will always be martyrs and saints. Remembrance Day, marked on November the 11th, or on Remembrance Sunday, continues, and its observation is of course widespread. In the poppy we have a very powerful symbol that's been loaded with all kinds of significance. For those in any sort of public position, the wearing of poppies for perhaps up to 2 weeks before seems almost obligatory, and if they don't, it seems to me they face the modern day equivalent of blasphemy charges by sections of the press. Whilst it's essentially a secular festival, it's celebrated in many places, including here, with sacral or quasi-sacral rites, as indeed will happen here on Remembrance Sunday. A further recent change has been the growth of festivals of remembrance, concerts with an act of remembrance, such as those at the Royal Albert Hall on Saturday, which have a significant entertainment aspect, and I don't say that in any derogatory fashion. So we again see perhaps the festival moving away from the church and the coming together of the secular and the seasonal strands, the entertainment and the community feasting strands, in a way that's completely consistent with the history of the season. But perhaps on Remembrance Day, it's also no bad thing to remember that it's also the feast day of St. Martin of Tours, who walked away from his career as a soldier to follow the way of Jesus, the Prince of Peace. But our country is changing, with an influx of new immigrant communities from around the world, and I suspect these will all have an effect on the season. The Catholic European and Latin American communities may bring a new life to the traditional sacral celebrations, whilst the black churches of the African communities may bring an increased awareness of the uncanny. But what will be particularly interesting is how these communities and also the large South Asian communities will begin to relate to the remembrance aspects of the season, remembering the departed on All Souls and those killed in conflicts on Remembrance Day. I don't know enough about these communities at all to be able to speculate, but these aspects of the season seem to me to be of general and universal relevance, and could be a major aid in the urgent need we have in this country to develop greater community coherence. So a season then of light and dark, a time to mourn, a time to laugh, a season of different strands and threads from a range of sources, but all now thoroughly mixed up together. I end with some very well-known words by William Walsh and Howe that speak of what to me is still the most important aspect of the season, the long-held Christian conviction that what we see is not all that there is, that the barrier between the church triumphant and the church militant is very thin, and that we are indeed surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. But lo, there breaks a still more glorious day. The saints triumphant rise in bright array. The King of glory passes on his way. Alleluia, alleluia. From earth's wide bound, from ocean's farthest coast, through gates of pearl streams in the countless host, singing to Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Alleluia, alleluia. Thank you for all of those who watched and listened to this. I hope you found something of interest and perhaps something that has even entertained you. Thank you again.